Hello, everybody. My name is Raul Martinez. Welcome to Friends of Calligraphy's lecture, Shaw on Sanvito. We have Paul Shaw giving the lecture today. If you have any questions during Paul's lecture, please type them into the chat window, prefixing them with 3 question marks, okay, so that we can find them easily. If the question is pertinent to what Paul is talking to at the moment, I will go ahead and interrupt him and ask him the question. Otherwise, we'll wait until the end of the lecture to ask him the question. So Paul Shaw is a calligrapher, typographer, graphic designer, and design historian. Among his many areas of interest has been the work of Renaissance scribe, Renaissance calligrapher Bartolomeo Sanvito, which he researched in detail in 1994 as part of a private sabbatical, and in 2002 as a fellow of the American Academy in Rome. Paul has been a member of numerous calligraphy organizations since 1977, including the Friends of Calligraphy, for whom he served as editor-designer of Alphabet for 2 years. Paul, you may go ahead now.
Thank you, Raul. Thank you, Nancy and Elena and the entire Friends of Calligraphy for asking me to do this talk. The talk was actually done originally for Raul's Black Letter Brunch last October. And for this version, I've added about 25% new material focusing on Sanvito and his use of color. This is going to be kind of a dry run for a talk I'm going to be doing for the SSI next summer, specifically about Sanvito and his use of color. So some of the things that I'll talk about later in the talk are preliminary. So let's get started. Here are the screen. And the screen is visible to everyone, Raul?
Yep, it looks good.
So I'm going to start by talking about how I got interested in Sanvito back in the 80s and early 90s, and why he was part of that private sabbatical I took in 1994. He was not the main purpose of it. I actually wanted to look at black letter, rotunda, and Batard manuscripts in Europe. But since once you get access to a library, it's always good to ask for other things that they have. And I looked at roughly 100 or more Sanvito manuscripts in that small period, and then a bunch more in 2002. So when I first came across Sanvito in, I guess, the 80s, people were sort of swooning over him, and I'd look at the samples of work we produced in the SSI Scribe or other publications, and I'd kind of shrug and think the guy looked kind of mediocre, because I was used to Arrighi as a benchmark. And most of you probably think of Arrighi in terms of his La Perina and his woodcuts, and those don't give you a true sense of Arrighi's ability. But in the early 80s, in my first trip to Europe, William Bostic, a calligrapher in Detroit and member of the Detroit Institute of Arts, told me, you've got to go to Amsterdam and look at their original Arrighi manuscript, which I did, despite a little bit of difficulty from the curator at the time. And you probably cannot do it in the way I did it back then. Back then, after the woman gave in to my request to see an original Arrighi and not a copy of La Perina, she simply opened up a drawer behind her desk, pulled the book out, took it to a little room across the hallway, put it on a table, and my girlfriend and I were left alone with this document with nobody watching us and no cameras. 300 pages of Aristotle. This is one page. They all look this good, this perfect, with nice justification, consistent, almost upright, italic. At the end of my looking at this, I said to the woman, 5 pages are missing. I wanted to make sure she didn't think I had stolen them. She said, yes, we know. Years later, I managed to see this again. It was still amazing. Now you have to go through all sorts of protocol to see it. But if you're in Amsterdam, you have to see this Arrighi. this is my benchmark and my way of judging Sanvito back in the early 90s. Another benchmark was looking at Bernardino Cattaneo, because his manuscript held at Harvard had been published in the 80s by Harvard University with an introduction by Stephen Harvard, not related, a designer and calligrapher, and quite an amazing document. Much later, 1550s or 1545, the Arrighi 1518. And it's important that these dates are much later than Sanvito dates, because I think one reason why the calligraphy by Cattaneo and by Arrighi is so much more consistent is the impact of printing, which occurred during Sanvito's lifetime, but really seemed to have affected scribes beginning in the 1490s. So here's Sanvito, at probably his best if you want to see his italic. And you can see it's a bit scrawny. It's not as consistent, not as upright, not as clean, not as sharp. And I tended to prefer Arrighi's anyway in my own personal calligraphy. Here are his caps, and these are the letters everybody was really swooning over. And I used to notice that his letter A would lean, his letter V would lean. I would think, can't this guy make letters that were upright? Well, I'll talk about that as we go on. Another way of looking at Sanvito was in terms of his antica, his humanist bookhand style, as opposed to his cursiva or italic, because he did both styles. And for me, sort of the standard for that was Antonio Sinibaldi, whose calligraphy had become the basis for a sort of a very minimally known typeface called either Laurentian or called humanistic, that was designed in 1904 by an American in Boston. And quite accurately, though somehow as accurate as it is, the typeface doesn't match the calligraphy. This is Sinibaldi, and he was a contemporary of Sanvito. Matter of fact, they collaborated, maybe not directly, but on several manuscripts. And for comparison, here is Sanvito's bookhand. There's Sinibaldi's, Florentine, and here's Sanvito, Paduan. And here you can again see some of his capitals. But once I've made that trip to, this is an anonymous scribe, just to get a sense of what other calligraphers were doing in terms of capitals, because that's where Sanvito was truly radical, not in his cursive, not in his bookhand, his antica, but in his capitals. And here you can see a typical set of capitals by a good Renaissance scribe, even though we don't know the name, or you can also see them in the very top, not particularly good example, by Sinibaldi. And here, for comparison to that previous manuscript, is a page by Sanvito, entirely in caps, one of his best manuscripts in the Casinatense Library in Rome. So after my time in 1994, looking at literally 100 or more manuscripts that Sanvito either entirely wrote out or only did parts of, I began to become a Sanvito adherent. And with my partner at the time in type design, Garrett Bogie, Letter Perfect was his company. I actually was his partner, more accurately. I suggested that we make a typeface based on Sanvito's capitals. And these are, I think, the earliest drawings I made after that. And part of the problem, of course, is trying to figure out which letters you're going to digitize from something that's handwritten, because every letter is different in a manuscript, which is why you can see some multiple versions of letters in this sample. Here's some other drawings when I thought the first ones were too thin. And then Garrett and I were at Oxford for A-Type I, and we went to meet Albini de la Mare, who was the expert on Sanvito. Unfortunately, Albini de la Mare, known as Tilly to her friends, passed away in late 2001. Before she could ever publish magnum opus on Sanvito that was done in 2009 or 2010 by her colleagues Laura Nuvoloni and Anthony Hobson in a book, unfortunately, a limited edition, which I'll be mentioning throughout this talk. But when we met with Albinia at her home outside of Oxford, she said, well, why don't you also do a typeface based on his cursive and his Antica, which tripled the difficulty. Well, I went ahead and started making drawings, as you can see here, for both of them. And then Garrett got bored with the idea, and I got busy with other things, and the whole project languished. I tried to revive it after Albinia's, the book of Albinia's notes was published with somebody who had been on the tours with Garrett and I in the 90s, Bart Bluebaugh. And for a year or two, we worked back and forth trying to do Sanvito's caps, much more sophisticated than we were doing in the 90s. And I could never make up my mind whether they look good or not. I think now they look a lot better than I thought back then. And I've used them in this talk for some of the headings, but they're missing numbers, they're missing punctuation. Maybe I will come back to them. Before Tilly de la Mare died, I was in touch with her in 2001 to talk about Sanvito because I had gotten a fellowship to the American Academy that began in January of 2002. And unfortunately, I think it was December of 2001 that Tilly died. She was, I think, only like 68 years old. She wasn't that old. And so our meeting never happened, even though I had met her twice, in the 1990s. But what I wanted to talk to her about was my project at the American Academy. And the project was to prove that Sanvito had influenced Renaissance sculptors in doing the inscriptions on tombs and other sculptures between the 1460s and 1490s. And I had this idea because I'd been looking at these inscriptions and making rubbings and kept noticing something that was very odd. Letters like the M here or the A here that were not symmetrical, that were leaning. And I kept being reminded of Sanvito's lean and thinking, well, Sanvito is writing, which is very different from somebody carving, because somebody carving presumably is drawing the letters on the stone, and there's no reason why they cannot make a perfectly symmetrical A or M or V or X. And yet I saw this over and over and over again. So that was the project I did at the American Academy. This is a Sanvito M that he drew but never got gilded in a manuscript. And these are rubbings from a tomb of Ludovico del Bre done by the workshop of Andrea Braño. And the connection between Andrea Braño and Sanvito was what I was trying to do while at the American Academy. And during that project, it occurred to me that the reason these letters were not symmetrical was they were not drawn on the stone, but somebody probably wrote them on the stone and wrote them with a broad brush in the same manner that Father Kaddish, has claimed that the ancient Roman lictors did the letters that became things like the Trajan inscription and others for the carver to follow. And I thought, well, why couldn't that same process be done in the Renaissance? And so I asked two calligraphers, Nicholas Benson, who's also a carver, the son of John Benson and grandson of John Henry Benson, who runs the John Stevens shop up in Newport. And then I also asked John Stevens, not related to the John Stevens shop, the master calligrapher, if both of them would take rubbings that I had made from these inscriptions, so they would have the real size, and see if they could, without tracing, could replicate the letters. And I gave them 4 or 5 different sizes, different tombs, different, all from the Braño workshop or a related workshop. And it was amazing what both of them could do. You're seeing Nicholas Benson's attempts at doing the Delbrays. That's his handwriting. And if I go back, this is what I gave him, these M's here. And this is what he did at real size with a broad brush. And I thought, well, that proves my theory that what Brainio was doing was having his workshop, whoever was the actual person that did this, we don't know, was saying to them, okay, look at these letters that, this guy Sanvito has done in a manuscript, and, copy those onto the tomb. And they would use a brush and then it'd be carved and you'd get this. So here's Sanvito below, just to show you, there's, his typical leaning A. Though not always that strong. Here's an M that I believe he drew and then was rubricated by one of the illuminators he worked with. So the next couple slides are samples from the workshop, not the workshop, but the final product I did during my time at the American Academy. I did a small little book trying to visualize the stages of my argument about the connection between Brainio and Sanvito. So you can see here on the right where I made enlargements of my sketches from the manuscripts I studied, because in studying the manuscripts, everything I've got are pencil drawn notes, no cell phone photos, nothing else, because you're not allowed to do that back then. And I simply enlarged my small drawings and then tried to figure out the ductus that Sanvito would have been doing, which I think explains why he has asymmetrically balanced letters, that he's a right-hander, he's moving to the right as he writes, and he's in a hurry. And he's really good despite being in a hurry, but he's in a hurry enough that his letters are not, perfectly symmetrical most of the time. And in a way, what I thought was a flaw when I first saw his work is actually one of his strengths. It's the sense of vitality, the sense that they've just been written. They're not dead on the page. At the bottom, I'm showing different types of serif endings that he had, because it depends upon the scale at which he wrote, because the bigger he wrote, the more he drew the letters or constructed them with a pen rather than writing them quickly. And the smaller he wrote, the more calligraphic they get. On the left, you're seeing my redrawing of a page of his taken from a photograph that I didn't make, which does involve, I think, some back and forth filling in with a pen or quill. Also on the right, here I've done some of the same thing, and I made some letters in different colors to show that he had, a regular size Y and a tall Y. Y and K are not Roman letters, they're Greek letters. So theoretically, they should not show up in his manuscripts, since he's writing for the most part Latin, but occasionally he will throw a Greek letter in, especially the Y, because to show off, to show his knowledge of ancient languages. This was something other humanists of the day did, and usually it was a tall Y, often called the palm Y for its shape, or the Greek Y. It's very rare to find one at this height early in his career. K shows up because it's in a couple key words that often show up in Latin manuscripts, words like Kyrie eleison and a couple others. And Z occasionally shows up. It's another Greek letter. So you can get almost the entire alphabet out of Sanvito's manuscripts, except for J. I think that's the only one. So here you can see some of the sizes that I recorded of his letters. The smallest ones being about a 1/16 of an inch, roughly. And so you can see that, his letters change, and we're used to seeing letters basically at this scale. What Albinia or Tilly and I often refer to as epigraphic letters. They're headings. They're trying to look like carved Roman capitals, but instead of being done at 10 inches high, they're being done at about 1/2 inch high. and not done with a brush on stone, but with a quill on parchment. So here's another comparison. So you can see Sinibaldi on the right and Sanvito on the left. Now, these two manuscripts are manuscripts that are not part of that corpus that Tilly de la Mare was working on and published in 2009. I mean, these are manuscripts that she was aware of, but did not include because they're not ones that Sanvito did completely. What's amazing about Sanvito is he added headings and titles to other people's manuscripts. In other words, somebody like Sinibaldi here on the right, this is a manuscript at the Public Library in New York, would do 200 pages. And then what would Sanvito do? He would do this line right here, not this line below it, that's Sinibaldi. And this M is probably Sanvito's drawing. And this manuscript by a little lesser known Renaissance scribe with a very angular cursive, Cecco, it should be Giuliano Cecchi, not, I got the name backward in the slide here. Sanvito did all of this. And probably that A, I'm not quite so sure. But all of this is Cecchi, and you can see his capital A's are incredibly narrow compared to Sanvito's. And I got really fascinated thinking, how could another scribe accept having somebody come in and do the juicy parts, the titles, the first thing you're going to see in a manuscript, the headings? And that kind of speaks to the fact that Sanvito was essentially a rock star in his day, that even though we didn't know in the 20th century who he was until early 1950s, he was so well known that he would be asked to do the opening sections of manuscripts by some of the best scribes of the day, people whose names we have known for centuries, like Sinibaldi. The other place where you find Sanvito in partial manuscripts is in a group of manuscripts that were probably done by students of Pomponio Leto. And Scott Dickerson, who I hope is here today, a member of FOC in San Francisco, who's done some important documentary research into Sanvito, which was included in that big book of de la Mare's notes, has theorized that Sanvito might have had a workshop of his own. And I think it's a very good theory. In this particular image, what you're seeing is a manuscript that's been identified as described as Partenio Munizio Pallini, a student of Pomponio Leto, except these two lines are Sanvito. And these two lines look to me like Mr. Pallini is trying to match Sanvito's capitals. And sometimes he gets there, other times like the R, he's totally lost. One of the things that people have loved about Sanvito since his sort of rediscovery, especially by calligraphers in the 80s and 90s, is his use of colored capitals, what Tilly de la Mare calls polychrome capitals, multicolored capitals. And they're not unique to Sanvito. Biagio di Saraceni in Venice was using them a couple of years before Sanvito began to work. And other scribes during Sanvito's time used them, whether influenced by him or by Saraceni, I don't know. But here's an example from a manuscript at the Vatican. And you can see that, they're colorful, but they don't have the quality of Sanvito. And yet whoever did these has a beautiful bookhand down below. We don't know who the scribe is. The Ptolemy manuscript scribe, the name is based on a manuscript that Sanvito did work on in Paris. And whoever the scribe was has been identified with several other manuscripts, including this one. So we're sort of talking about other scribes in Sanvito and how Sanvito is very well known today, but he wasn't well known until the end of the 40s, early 50s. And that's because Sanvito didn't sign his manuscripts until the end of his life. And so people were aware of a lot of manuscripts that were really beautiful, but they had no idea who did them, or in some cases, they thought other scribes they knew of had done them, such as this one, which is partially done by Tofio. Tofio did these 3 lines, maybe that line too. No, he did everything. No, this is Sanvito right here. 1 line of Sanvito, just the blue. And for a long time, people who were quite skillful, like Alfred Fairbank, the calligrapher, thought that manuscripts now associated with Sanvito were actually Tofio's work. And even Tilly de la Mare thought that for a while. And only in the book that came out in 2009 does she try to untangle her own misattribution of the past. And you can see, how easy it would be to confuse these letters with these, especially when you don't have manuscripts next to each other to compare. You don't have photographs like we have today in color and digital images. But here is Sanvito. This manuscript was in the past attributed to Tofio. This is one of the ones. And yet now when I look at it, I find it hard for anybody to have made that mistake. But it takes a good eye. He probably also did the A, given that it's leaning, even though all the decoration is in the Florentine, Bianchi Gerari style. When Albinia's book posthumously came out, I went through it and scanned all the images and then started trying to analyze all of his capitals, something which I was doing in the 1990s, but had kind of given up on. It was much easier when you actually had real photographs and not my sketches to base it on. But I haven't gone any farther than the notes on the side, trying to see what he was doing. So let's get into Sanvito's life. So he's born in 1433, I believe, is now the accepted date, and 1511 is the accepted date of his death. Those dates have changed over the years. Scott Dickerson has done the major research into documents to discover what we now think are the real dates. And his first manuscript is that we know he did is in 1452. Tilly broke his life up into phases based on some stylistic changes and also based on where he was living. He was from Padua, but he moved around. I'm not going to try to go into all that detail because I want to get to stuff of interest to calligraphers, but I'm using her rough phases to organize what I'm showing in the next group of slides. So from 1452 to 1461, he's still in Padua, but he's doing work for people from Venice, which is very close by. One of his first important patrons is from Venice, Trevisan. And you can see in this early manuscript of his that the capitals here don't look at all like what we associate with Sanvito. They look like those ones that I kind of shrugged at by Sinibaldi in the manuscript that's in the public library in New York. 1452. So at this point, what is he, 19 years old roughly? But soon after, he starts to do the multicolored capitals, probably had influenced by the manuscript by Saraceni, which is 1450 roughly. There's no gold in the sequence, and the colors he begins to use in his mature years are gold, blue, red, green, and purple in that order. At this point, there's no gold. There's only blue, red, green, and purple. It's going to, in these slides, it'll often be hard to tell green and gold apart. and sometimes even purple and blue apart. So this is green you're seeing. And anybody can see the faint purple leaves here. So the dates at the bottom of these slides are taken from Tilly de la Mare's corpus. And so this is a date range that she has assigned to the manuscript. And if you're looking at the captions, it's the date range, it's the name of the manuscript, the shelf mark for the manuscript, the name of the author, the title, and the location by library. This one in the Bodleian is one that's been heavily focused on, because here you're seeing drawn letters and you're seeing a letter that looks like it's trying to be a piece of metal. And Jonathan Alexander, a friend of Tilly de la Mare's and a famous art historian in his own right, he was one of the people behind the famous Painted Page exhibition in the 1990s. He calls these faceted initials, and often describes them as if they were objects. So there's an interesting thing where the Renaissance illuminators would make drawings of letters that were inspired by carved Roman inscriptions, which are incised into the stone, but they would often then paint them as if they were metal letters that were raised up, sort of in reverse. This one is flat. It doesn't have the middle ridge that you'll see in other images. And little by little, we're seeing Sanvito discover how to make small epigraphic capitals that resemble carved Roman classical capitals, imperial capitals. Already he's breaking away from what you see from earlier Paduan and Florentine scribes. And we're as early as 1453, possibly. So it's only a year after that one in the Bodleian. And we're seeing that gold is now part of the colors. So you can see gold next to green. And usually you can tell the gold because it's usually a little fatter, the letters, or because there's some sort of like halo effect around them. This T fascinated a couple art historians. They thought that this was a really distinctive thing that you could help identify who did what by it. They linked it to Mantegna because he's got some work involving a T like that, and also Felice Feliciano. It shows up, I think, in either one or two manuscripts of Sanvito's. It's not a typical thing, and maybe he was copying one of them and then went off in his own direction. This very peculiar way of doing the serifs at the top of the T. Here's what I mean by sometimes the gold is very obviously gold versus the green. I don't know what the effect is. It gives us, in this particular one, almost like the letters are radioactive. But there's that T still. So we know this is an early Sanvito just by that letter. But here we can see he's already done a much more logical one for a calligrapher. Serifs that are parallel, angled in the direction of writing. He doesn't really follow Roman inscriptional letters to the T. You can see he puts a serif sometimes on the tops of a capital A. And almost always he puts them on tops of M's and N's. It's very rare when you don't see them there. So he's working as a calligrapher, trying to interpret these capitals. He's not making exact sort of copies. This manuscript has a very awkward looking edge, and that's because it's one of several in Torino. And the library in Torino caught fire in early 20th century. I think it was 1902 or 1908. And the parchment didn't get burnt up, but it did get destroyed in various ways. Some of them are all curled and wrinkly. This one, some pages are relatively flat. It's really a horrible thing to see, and this is the best of them in terms of photography. And what you're seeing here is something that's typical of a lot of Sanvito's manuscripts. What's called all antica in Italian, meaning everything is antique, classicized, that Sanvito's letters are trying to be ancient, but also the illumination, the rubrication, the images, the borders, they're all being done to suggest ancient Rome. Very different from seeing a manuscript like, where'd it go? That one, which has a typical Renaissance Bianchi Girari white vine border. Instead, what Sanvito is part of is a shift to this all antica style, which we're going to see in more detail in a minute. You can see a little bit of it here. This is like a sense of a tomb, and so in place of an inscription, here's the text. But of course, this initial kind of ruins it. That's not done by Sanvito. I don't know who did that. But you also see classical figures and objects. Well, there's an example of the white vine. This is in University of Texas, this manuscript. It's a Horace. Quite a complex design, this one. So Sanvito begins to do work in Rome in the 1460s. He's also in Padua during this decade. He's also occasionally in Florence and in Mantua. And in Rome, he's there because of a patron, Trevisan, and he's in Mantua because another patron, the Gonzaga family. And here we can see a manuscript that has some of the all antica. And here we can see one that's really obviously that. This is the Trojan horse from Virgil's Aeneid at the top. And in this particular one, we can see that Sanvito has done the writing first, and then his collaborator, probably Gaspari da Padova in this case, another Paduan, has worked around his S that has gone into the margin. So Sanvito didn't bother, to try to make sure he fit within his guidelines. Though we can see where he does try to do that, like here with the A, he's tucked it in, nested it. And here's one of, I think, two examples where Sanvito has done the letters, at least the underdrawing for the illuminator to do, to imitate an inscriptional letter. There's another one that's in, I believe, the V&A in London. This example, this manuscript is a text by Bernardo Bembo, and people will know the name, the typeface Bembo. And Bernardo Bembo, according to Scott Dickerson's research, knew Sanvito. And so there's a possible link between Sanvito and Aldus Manutius, the printer, via Bembo. And that's important because Aldus Manutius produces small pocket-sized books in the early 1500s that are supposedly influenced by small pocket-sized books that Sanvito had been doing in the 2 decades previously. I mentioned an earlier Caesar in the Cassanetense in Rome as one of, in my view, the top Sanvito manuscripts. Other Caesar in the Ambrosiana in Milan would be another one. And we'll see some other pages from this later on. Sanvito is now at the powers of his height in the 1460s. This manuscript, which is now in the library in Parma, is notable for this capital E with wine barrels spilling their wine. So I guess the patron had some connection to wine. It's a Eusebius. And Sanvito did 5, as far as I could count, of these Eusebius manuscripts. Eusebius did a chronicle of the history of the world, and then St. Jerome added to that chronicle to include part of the Christian world after the life of Eusebius. And they're amazingly complex manuscripts. I will show you a couple of pages at the very end of this talk. I think you could do a whole talk just on one of those manuscripts. You're not seeing the complexity in this opening page, this frontispiece. So I'm skimming through so you can see, not in exact order, since some of the dates are rough until he's counting, of Sanvito's arc of his career. Here's that effect of the gold kind of glowing, possibly being rubbed by the pages as the books have been opened over time. In the 1470s, through the early 1480s, Sanvito is in Rome and doing work not just for the Gonzaga family, but for other important people in the church and nobility, and not just in Italy, but even people outside of Italy. John Tiptoft of England, King Matthias of Hungary, and others commission him. This one is one of several manuscripts he did of a text by Bartolomeo Platina. Platina was the first Vatican librarian, a very important figure. There's also a connection possibly between Andrea Braño and Sanvito. I'm not sure what to call this weird decoration. Sanvito uses it occasionally to fill in a line. I kind of think it ruins the designs. And sometimes he leaves empty space, so I'm not sure whether that reflects a desire to get rid of empty space, or he changed his attitude over the years. And a rare Z in his work. Another one from Platina. This one's in Scotland. It's one I've not seen in person. My images, many of them are coming from that corpus that they put together, Tilly de la Mare's. So the images are based on the quality of whatever she, Lord Nuvoloni and her colleagues were able to acquire for the book. And I would swear that some images came from the 1950 slides, and that today we should be able to do better than that. This one is in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. This is one of the best examples of the All Antica style. And what I like about some of these, the height with Gaspari da Padova as his collaborator, is the way in which the initial letters are treated. And I don't know whether that's Gaspari's idea or Sanvito's involved in it, but I mean, here, these figures are treating it like an easel that they're painting against, and the coat of arms is blocking the crossbar of the A. This one, the satyrs are carrying the S on a staff. So sometimes the initial letter is not really large as we would expect it to be in some of these designs. This, I am guessing, might be the Pyramid of Cestius in Rome, but it could be some other tomb. It looks like the coat of arms are missing on this one. Here, the putti are playing around a capital letter S. This one is in a private collection. It's always listed as a library, but it's actually in a private mansion in Genoa. I got to see that in 2002. And what is so great about this manuscript of Marshall is on the frontispiece here, you've got a drawing of the Colosseum. And it may have been intact back then compared to today. Now, as I'm going through these quickly, you'll notice that the way in which he uses color is not consistent. You're seeing different approaches, and that's what I'm going to try to, I'm speeding up to try to talk about at the end of the talk today. This one I have not seen in person either. It's in Germany. But I would love to. It's a beautiful page. And Pegasus, who's the back half of Pegasus is missing. A great little Trump doy going on, or maybe it's hiding behind the blue. He's still in Rome in the 1480s. And here we've got another Horace. And what's interesting is he did, the same text multiple times for different clients, but not always the same way. And I'm sure that in the voluminous notes that Tilly left behind, there must be ones in which she's comparing, different authors over the course of time to see how he would reinterpret, the calligraphy and also his collaborators for the illumination. This M has a little lamb stepping through the M, and clearly his M. There's the influence, I think, of Sanvito making these letters. So even when we don't have the underdrawings visible to us, I think his hand is clearly there, because his movement from left to right in a hurry often left longer serifs at the top left and at the bottom right. And that's some of the effect that I saw in the inscriptions that Bragnio's workshop did in Renaissance Rome. This is one in the public library in New York. We've got, I think, was it 5 or 6 manuscripts of Sanvito's between the Morgan Library and the public library in New York. Another Eusebius, this one in the British Library, probably more famous than the one in Parma. And there is the E that begins Eusebius's name, perched on this plinth like it's an actual object. And that would be Saint Jerome, who continued the chronicle with his trademark lion. And here's some putti dressing up and scaring each other. And the V that starts this line almost looks like it's coming down from the book that St. Jerome has next to him. In the 1490s, Sanvito is going back and forth between Rome and his hometown of Padua. And so Tilly's not sure where some of the manuscripts were created. This one of Petrarch's songs and triumphs, one of several manuscripts versions he did of Petrarch. This one has the initial letter never got put in, or the decoration. And Sanvito, in the same way that early printers did, has a little letter to tell the person what should go there. Presumably, if the illumination was done, this would have been covered up and you wouldn't see it. Excuse me. One of the Morgan Library manuscripts, and I'm not sure whether Sanvito did this particular Q. Often his Q's and O's have a more of a distortion to this shape. Another Petrarch. This one in a private collection, so there's no credit as to where it's located exactly. There's a couple that are in, at least to the general public, unknown private hands. Whoever sold them, the art dealers, the book dealers might know. And here you can see that line down the center I was mentioning earlier that suggests that these are objects as opposed to letters carved into a stone. Anybody familiar with optical illusions? If you make a drawing like that, sometimes you think you're drawing something that's inside, but it may look like it's actually in relief. But here, often through the shading, they're suggesting relief in Jonathan Alexander's view. So Sanvito developed arthritis at some point, and that was one way that Tilly de la Mare was able to start dating a number of his manuscripts by seeing changes in his writing. This is not the first example of his arthritic writing, but this one has a date on it. And I don't know if you can tell that his writing is a little wobblier here, and yet his capitals are quite good. And I'm not quite sure how to explain it, except for the fact that, since I got my hand damaged several years ago, I can't write very well really small, but I can write better, bigger. And for some things, if I take more time, I can write better. So that might be why Sanvito could write such, well, there's a little wobble to that eye there, but less wobbly than this. This is important because it's one of several manuscripts towards the end of the 1490s that were signed BS. And that's how Augusto Campana and James Wardrop, between 1947 and 51, recognized who was making these manuscripts that both men thought were some of the best manuscripts of their day. And eventually, BS, they realized, was Bartolomeo Sanvito. And you can see that even at the end of his life, he's still doing very excellent capitals. So for the last 9 years of his life, he's back in Padua. Done some work for a local church in Monselice, where they made him a canon, sort of gave him a pension. He began working with a different illuminator for the manuscripts during that time. This one with a very unusual narrow shape is in Princeton University. And I don't think Sanvito would have done this letter because the axis of it doesn't match the way other Q's and O's of his are. So whoever did this made the break because Sanvito forced them to, since the calligraphy came first. Other times, I think Sanvito might have suggested a break like that in the tail of the Q. This is a Virgil, very different from the earlier Virgil, a little more of a pocket book rather than a big fancy one. Here's that later collaborator, Mario, I remember the name now. I've lost it on my notes. Antonio Villaflora, I believe it is. Very different type of illumination than Gasparo de Padovan's Al Antica style of several decades earlier. Here's the tall palmate Greek Y I mentioned earlier. It replaces the letter I. It's there simply to show off. And it also shows up in some of Andrea Braño's workshops inscriptions, another of the connections that I tried to draw between the two men. All right, see if we can finish this in the next 10 minutes or so. So comparison of capitals. You've already seen some of these manuscripts. These are early Sanvito, so you can see him drawing to some extent his letters, and here's him writing them, not at his mature ability, but still written rather than some extra strokes to try to get like the weight, the bracketing of the serifs. And here's his mature capitals. This one's a photograph, I believe, from the one in Genoa. And so you can see the pen making the letters. So he's not trying to do what other people were trying to do at the time, which was to draw and imitate what the chisel had done in imperial capitals. He's much more concerned, I think, in getting the spirit and getting the proportions and that overall quality, and not about a detail about whether the bracketing on the serif is curved or not. And you can see his haste in the way his S's often look like they're running to the right. And here are two details. So you can see a really small Sanvito down here and see how he's got a very steep pen angle and almost a reverse weight, more like a rustic compared to larger ones. And these are from the same manuscript. All right, the polychrome capitals. Tilly at the end of the back of the corpus that was done lists 13 different sequences of capitals he does. In preparing this talk, I think that there are more, but she often in her notes says, well, there's a variant, without explaining what the variant is. And so maybe some of what I think are different sequences are really just in her mind variants. And this is something which I need to go further on. I spent a couple days in preparing this, trying to come up with things. Her sequences end with J, lowercase I. So any letter you see after J is one that I have tentatively invented. But here's his earliest one before he was using gold. So blue, red, green, purple, alternating throughout the lines. And there's a question that I really would love to ask Tilly if she was still alive about how he does the sequences. I think sometimes the sequences change when he gets to an initial letter, as well as changing when he changes scale of letters. Here's where he now has gold added. So gold now becomes the first color instead of blue. And he alternates in that 5-color sequence. You can see how some of the quality of the slides available. The purple is kind of brownish, and the green is sort of a yellowish green. I'm also curious in Tilly's questioning whether or not she includes the leaves and interpoints, which we'll see in her counting of sequences, because I think some sequences Sanvito plays with those. This image from the British Library, and it's not a pretty good one online, shows sequence B that I'm calling a variant because he's now doing it vertically. Gold, blue, red, green, gold, green, purple, gold, blue, red, etc. And here in this subhead, you can see blue before gold before red, which is a different sequence of hers. And there you can see letters showing through from the other side of the parchment. In sequence C, and these descriptions are partially my descriptions of what she's describing, because sometimes her language seems a little convoluted to me. He's doing pairs of letters. So he's got gold, and then he does a pair of colors, blue and red, gold, and then a pair of colors, green and purple, and then repeats this sequence. So here's where you can see gold against green very clearly. So it's green and blue and red, gold, then green and purple, gold, blue and red, gold. Well, actually now we're getting new lines. So now we're starting, now although the gold is repeated after the blue and the red, we're now getting green and purple. So sometimes Sanvito will continue the sequence immediately. Other times he will start afresh, but then continue the sequence. So that's where I think some of the variants definitely show up in her thinking. JI that she lists is one that I had trouble finding as just a pure JI. She says it's alternating words, but every time I could find it, it's not complete words, it's parts of words. And sometimes, as you see here, part of one word and part of the next word. So I'm calling them alternating letter groups. So gold, blue, red, gold, green, and then because the initial letter, in my view, he's now starting again. But what do you have here? Purple. And then you got blue, and then the text begins. Another variant that I've come up with is, what does he do with the puncti? Puncti are these little marks. They're copying what the lictor would have done on Roman inscriptions. It's like a comma shape. And sometimes Sanvito makes them the same color as letters on the line, but here he's making them the color that's also the color of the words. But these, in this case, these are pink, which means it's red. So it's the next color in the sequence. And here it's green, next color in the sequence, purple, next color in the sequence, blue, next color in the sequence. I don't know whether Albania, noticed this or not when she talks about variants. These fascinate me, especially also now, of course, it's blue, the leaf is blue. Another variant, and these are words, as she says, but they don't follow her sequence exactly because in the gold, he does a whole line in gold. And then he goes blue, red, green, purple. And this is one manuscript where the underlying drawings are visible, one that I was not able to, that is now available online. So we can see more of these underlines and that extra hanging over. Albinia's DI is alternating lines where there's no gold, even though this is later. And this is from a manuscript that was digitized by Octavo back in the early 2000s, CD-ROM, the entire thing. It's a cookbook. It's now in private hands. I don't know who. So here the color is by line, not by letter. Blue, red, green, purple, including the leaf, blue, red, including the nested letters, and red, including the abbreviation mark, and purple here, including the punctus. This sequence might be one of Albinia's variants. I wasn't sure. It has no gold. This is in the, I've mislabeled it. This is in the Marshall in Genoa, where these subheads follow a sequence. I can tell it's Genoa because that's the owner's fingers I recognize, not the Victorian Albert to fix it. This sequence of Albinia's is alternating lines, gold, blue, now back to gold, now to red, gold, green, gold, purple, gold, blue, and so on. This one, also Albinia's, is a different sequence of alternating lines. We're starting with blue instead of green, and then alternating. And this is in the Ambrosiana, which has a lot of different sequences in it. It's a very complicated manuscript, the Julius Caesar. This is one of mine, where he's doing a sequence that doesn't make sense. He's got blue and then purple. And that's not the usual order of these colors. Red and green are missing. And then he does green, and red never shows up. As I said, she may have considered this a variant of one of her other ones. But without seeing more of her detailed notes, I'm not sure whether this is something that she didn't see or it's something she viewed in a different manner. Same with this one, also this one from the Casanatense, another Caesar, where once again no red is visible. Gold, green, gold, purple, and then he splits things, and that fascinates me. And he talks about half lines, and I'm not sure if he means half lines in half of the line or half of the size of the letter in height, because he also plays with that. And when he splits them, it has to do with the initials. So the blue is here, but if you put the blue here, it wouldn't make a nice alternating color with the purple. That's why he's gone to the gold, at least in my view. This is her GI sequence where you have pairs of letters, but now it's lines with pairs, not pairs throughout a line. You can keep all these straight. And then a different one with colored pairs of lines. This time it's blue and red before the gold shows up, green and purple, and then gold. This was the first one that I decided to make my own letter number for. I think she used letters. I would prefer numbers. So I may redo all this, but I got interested in the puncti, and this is how I sort of think he's doing it. As you can see down below with these vertical bars indicating a change of line. So this color becomes that color on the next line. This color becomes that color on the next line, except not here. So he's doing some interesting things. Another one where I think he's using, this is Albinia's letter where he's using triplets of lines. So blue, red, green, that's gold, and then purple, blue, red. This one from the Ambrosiana, I think it has two things going on. It's got what I am calling sequence S, alternating lines with triplets, but then below the initial, he's gone to her sequence of C with pairs. So you can see red, gold, green, gold, purple, gold, blue, gold. That's hard to see that that's green. This is gold, that's green. Her sequence E is one of the most common of his. That's the one in almost all the really exciting manuscripts on their frontispieces, where he does both alternating letters per line and then a sequence that changes by line. So it's getting very complex when he does these. And these vertical lines show you as he's changing the line. So that's one line alternating, next line alternating, third line, fourth line, and then goes back to this, theoretically. There are variants of it. Here's where he does what you might call either a half line letter or a small cap. And that would be the next color in this sequence, where it's going blue, red, gold, red, gold, green, gold. Then you should have purple, gold, but instead he just does all purple. And then this is somebody else. This is a manuscript he did not do. That's the other scribe. This is in Vienna. And I've not seen this one in person. These are groups of letters like one of the earlier ones I showed, but they change by line, not just by within the line. It changed from line to line. And here he's doing what I've started to call split lines rather than half lines, because he's kind of splitting it exactly down the center. So gold, red, blue, gold, gold, green, purple, gold. Gold is in the initial, therefore blue. Was it gold, red, green, gold, gold, purple. And then here he does sets of 3 letters, or in this case, 5 letters and 4 letters. So he's got actually 2 different sequences in one. I probably should have put a note to that. A similar thing is happening here. She does have she talks about him using gold and blue, but if I read her right, not at this level, at a smaller level. And she doesn't mention splitting the line as he does here. And here's where you can see that he's trying not to have blue underneath blue. So I don't know why he didn't make that gold, but maybe he had an imaginary line that was his demarcation. All right, we're near the last, I think, two or three slides. I think that there are meta sequences of his colors. And at one point, there is a note in the corpus where Tilly mentions a sequence that goes over a couple pages. It's not in the manuscript that's visible online, so I can't put it in this talk. But I think that there are times where he actually has sequences that you think are incomplete, but they actually continue pages later. These are 3. This is one example I was able to find from digitized images. These are small subheads. And so all he has are 3 colors at a time. So blue, purple, this time red, blue, purple, next time green, blue, purple, next time red, then purple, then green, then purple. And here you can see in the King's 24 Virgil at the British Library, which is one of his best manuscripts, that has 3 different books by Virgil, the Bucolica, Georgica, and Aeneas. And at the beginning of each one, he has a different sequence. And then when he gets to books 2 and books 3, he has other sequences. But it's interesting to compare the very first book of each of these separate texts and how doesn't want to repeat himself. I think Sanvito got bored. Oh, also the other thing to see on that page, look at the Q. that was deliberately broken so it wouldn't go into. And so I suspect he drew that to make sure it wasn't going to interfere. I mentioned the Eusebiuses are super complex. So for the last images, I just want to give you a general sense of how complex they are. I think they're way too complicated to even try to explain today. This is an opening page. So these are histories of civilizations: Babylonian, Assyrian, Egyptian, Roman, Grecian, Mycenaean, etc. And Sanvito color codes each civilization. This is modern information design. And even in this list of Assyrian kings, he uses his sequence of colors. And another sequence there. And as he talks about other key figures in these different empires, the Mycenaeans, the Athenians, you can see he's using colors for the names of these people: Pyrrhus, Lysimachus, etc. But that's not the really cool part of these books. The really cool part is when he begins to give the histories of these civilizations, he creates these little lunette designs for each civilization with different color combinations of the stripes within the lunettes, and the decorations are different for each one. He gives each civilization a color, and there's far more colors than his usual 5. So he begins adding colors like brown and ochre and pink versus red, which is a real problem from fading. And I think two shades of purple, if I remember correctly, to show the different civilizations. And colors get reused as civilizations rise and fall. So here you can see a spread just to see how complicated things get, because there's also different colors being used for texts within the chronology of what's happening year by year. And then for special things like the Olympics happening or the birth of Christ. And that's where we're going to stop. So thank you, all of you, and thank all the people here whose work I have built upon. And I guess now we're open for questions. And Raul, we were going to let people know about some of the posts I've done. Raul, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Paul. I'm going to put in the chat, and I will also include this in the email that I send out with the recording of the lecture, the links to your blog, in which you include the photos and the Sanvito photos that.
I will just summarize what the what's on the blog. After I gave the talk for the Black Letter Brunch last fall, I realized that most people don't have access to the corpus of Sanvito that Laura Nuvoloni and Anthony Hobson did roughly 15 years ago, because only a few copies were made and they were very expensive. So it occurred to me that maybe I would just summarize some of what was in there. And so I did 3 blogs trying to summarize Sanvito manuscripts, but also linking as many of them as I could to digitized versions of the manuscripts, so that people can go and look at some of this stuff themselves. I haven't to live in New York or London or Rome or Austin, Texas, wherever some of these things are located. Some of them are entirely digitized, every single page, and some of them in really good resolution. Others are digitized kind of mediocre, and some are only just selected pages. So on my website, I've got Bartolomeo Sanvito 1, which is all the manuscripts that Tilly lists in the corpus as ones that he worked almost entirely on. And then Sanvito 2 is manuscripts that she and various articles and elsewhere or in the notes to her book list as ones that Sanvito contributed to. And sometimes it's only a word in 1 or 2 of the manuscripts. Other times it's a line or 2. Some of it, it's the most important part for us visually. It's the frontispiece. And then the third list is a list of some of the scribes that have been either confused with Sanvito, like Tofio, or who were identified as the scribes of the manuscripts that Sanvito only did parts of. So that's why there are 3 lists. And if anybody, finds mistakes or things that need to be updated, let me know, so I can make those corrections.
There were several other questions that people had. I'll start from the top. Anne-Marie Fleming wanted to know who are the authors of the book on Bartolomeo Sanvito. I know that Albinia de la Mare was one of them, but there were others.
De la Mare, well, I mean, she's the author in the sense that it's her notes that are being reproduced. She was deceased at the time, it's posthumous. Laura Nuvoloni, who's a paleographer in either Cambridge or London now. She's been moving around over the last couple of years. She's the main person for that. Anthony Hobson was involved because he's a specialist in bindings. Ellen Erdreich helped out with the section on Sanvito and illumination and disputes among art historians as to whether he did illumination or not. And I think Ellen's on the side that he did do some himself, not as well as working with people who are identified. Scott Dickerson contributed the important chronology to it, updating stuff based on his research that superseded Albinia's earlier articles. I think those are the 5 people: Albinia, Laura, Anthony, Ellen, and Scott. And the book was put out by like some bibliophile society. The details are on my blog. Next question.
Lee L. from Portland asked, did Sanvito do any of the illuminations in his manuscript? I believe you touched on.
Yeah, I just touched on that. It's an argument at least in the 80s and 90s among a number of art historians. Ellen Erdreich believes that he did do certain ones, and I'm on her side. I'm positive in a lot of them, whether he did it or not, he did the underdrawing for the initials. Not all of them that are in the corpus, because there are some that are clearly somebody else, but a lot of them have his quirks. And since when I was doing my research, only 2 underdrawings were visible to me at that time, but there's now a couple more that are visible because of digitization. And so far, the ones that I've noticed are fitting the theory that he drew the letters and then somebody else, did the painting on some of those. But if you want to get, the thinking of it, the most up to date is from 14 years ago when the book came out, unless Ellen has newer information.
Okay. Roxanne Smith asked, what is the typical size of the pages?
Yeah. I'm not good at that. I would say quarto, but he was doing these smaller octavo, the ones that are described as the Libris Portatatalis, in the late 80s and 90s, the ones that influenced Aldus Manutius. So the pocketbook ones, think of a paperback. The small ones, the big ones are big. I mean, the octavos are big books. They're not, he's not doing enormous Bibles. And his writing basically ranges from 5/8 of an inch for what I call the marginal capitals, which are often blue, to roughly a 1/2 inch or 3/8 for the epigraphic ones that are on the frontispieces, and then down to like a 1/16 of an inch for some colored capitals that show up in text or as notes on the side. And those initials are about 1 inch in height. I'm just off the top of my head, 1.5 inches. I'd have to look at my old notes to see what I used to write.
Okay. And so I guess that answers Pedro Amato's question. At what size is that typical bookhand X height for the
typical bookhand X height? be about eighth of an inch.
Eighth of an inch. Elizabeth Lonoff asked, one of the sequences instead has gold in the middle of the sentence. Oh, and then how readily can someone visit the examples held in New York City libraries?
Well, for both the Morgan, definitely, you have to, both you have to make an appointment with special collections at the public library, with the Morgan. I don't know what their rules about who they allow to see things anymore are. I mean, I saw them in the 90s, and rules keep changing. Some places, will insist that you're some sort of specialist academic, and they don't like calligraphers. And I'm thinking about my experience in the 90s with the Bodleian, where I had to get a reader's card, and I was being interviewed for it. And the man said to me, Bruce Barker Benfield said, some people are seeing Sanvito everywhere. And I just said, well, that's because he is everywhere. And I thought, oh shit, why did you say that? This guy's not gonna give you a card. And as soon as I said that, he gave me the card. And I told the story to Tilly. She started laughing because apparently she and Bruce Barker Benfield had been colleagues at Oxford. And so she implied that he was skeptical of a lot of her attributions since they're not signed manuscripts. And that she was seeing what she wanted to see. And I was here defending her. Because I think she had a great eye. And I think it was because she knew people like Alfred Fairbank and Bertold Volpi, who were calligraphers and who helped her recognize things. But she developed a good eye on her own. And anyway, that Barker Benfield was complaining that calligraphers would keep showing up at the Bodleian and saying, "Oh, I want to see this manuscript because my teacher told me it was really important." And he just couldn't stand that, and for also good reason, in the sense that manuscripts are one of a kind and too many people handle them. They want the people handling them to have a purpose beyond the fact that some teachers said, "Oh, this is really important." So if you want to go to the Morgan, you want to near public library, do some research and have like a plan. Like I want to study, the sequence of colored capitals, and I've already looked at these things in various books. Now I want to see a real one, so I can see the ink on the parchment. I can see the fading. Maybe I can see a pen, some ruling. That will tell them that you're serious and not just a calligraphic tourist. And that will apply to any library, not just the two in New York. I would give that advice, and I would use it also for things beyond Sanvito. If you want to study Rotunda, you want to study Batard, you want to look at Arrighi in Amsterdam.
Yeah. Amanda Adams noticed that some of the letters appeared faded, especially referring to one of the Virginia and Albert manuscripts. Victoria and Albert, excuse me. Has that read faded, or was that intentional, do you think?
No. Well, there's two problems here. Is that you're looking at my digitizations of other people's digitizations or photographs. And some of the photographs that I was using as sources, I think, are slides that are ancient, and some of the colors I don't trust because of the photography. But in looking at some of the things in person, the reds in some cases are very pinky, and the greens are very yellow. Much less green than in my little diagrams. The blues are in good shape. Gold, other than being abraded, is in good shape in most of them. And the purple is usually good, but the reds and the greens, and sometimes even in real life, I couldn't tell whether I was looking at a yellow, green, or a gold. Sometimes I had a lot of trouble, but that was 30 years ago. Maybe today I'd be better at it.
Michael Starkman asks, can you tell us what typeface you used for the title cards?
My own.
That was your own.
It's a mix of the two typefaces I described at the very beginning. The one that Garrett and I did, which we called Padua, and then Bart and I called the other versions just Beta 1 or Beta 2. They never got any real names. In fact, over the years, I've been debating whether to call them Padova, which is the Italian pronunciation, or Padua. I can't call him Sanvito because Robert Slimbach did a typeface for Adobe called Sanvito. There's no connection to his work. It's a nice typeface, but he just, he stole the name before I could steal it. If people would like the one that Garrett and I did, let me know. I can make it available. It's never been for sale, but you'll be stuck with its limitations. Does not have a full character set, not even a full postscript character set.
And finally, Susan Mentis asked, were the color sequences only specific to Sanvito's career, or did other scribes follow his method?
Well, Biagio di Saraceno did a color sequence, was it blue, red, green, purple, a couple of years before Sanvito's first example. So Tilly believes that's where he would have seen it. Saraceno was in Venice. He did a famous manuscript at the end of early 1450s. Anyway, other scribes, yeah. I mean, I showed one slide of somebody else doing polychrome capitals. I think it's not a scribe who's identified. I'd have to go look at the PDF to see what his sequence is. I didn't catalog it, but that's an interesting question, because it would be nice to look at other scribes doing polychrome capitals and see if not only are they using his colors, are they using his sequences? I mean, they may just be mixing the colors up in any old way that of their own, and there's more than just that one example. I mean, after I did the talk last fall and I was preparing the 3 blog lists, I was looking at other digitized manuscripts at the Vatican and some other libraries online, and I was finding a surprising number of scribes doing polychrome capitals. And I think, the more you find this stuff, and some of them were scribes who've been, confused with Sanvito, but others, are not listed in Tilly's work as people being confused with him, though. So whether or not she was aware of them or not, I mean, she was, her interests were broader than Sanvito in terms of Renaissance calligraphy. So she may have known of many of these, but just not published the information. So it's certainly worth investigating.
Marianne White asks, are his bookend styles as distinctive as his caps? Have they also been attributed? I think she means, are his bookhand styles as distinctive as his caps?
He had 2 styles of doing the text. He had a cursive. I mean, it calls it a cursiva. We would call it an italic. And he also had what I call a bookhand, which often referred to as his tondo, his Roman, or his Antica. He basically had 2 styles, but there are letters and groups of letters that changed over the years, and that's how she's dated a lot of the manuscripts. A key thing was how he made lowercase h. That his early ones, he would make it with the leg of the H dropping and hooking below the line, which is not that unusual. You find it in black letter, and you find it in early Roman type. And then he switches to an H, just like the one that we're used to with a regular leg, or it's, that Nicholas Jensen is the first printer to make a type with that in 1470. And just as I think about just now, I don't know whether Albini ever linked his switch to a non-hooked H with Jensen's H, or whether Jensen may have gotten the idea by seeing Sanvito. That's a major thing in terms of type. Also, she noted how he would do abbreviations, like the word essay, E-S-S-E. He would do often E, was it E, with two small S's over the two E's, and then sometimes he had a little loop, an abbreviation mark, or ligature mark. Those are the two that jump out at me. Also, of course, how big he made his Z's, and sometimes his Z's are super large, even though they're in the middle of a word, they're not capital letters. Z would show up in Italian, not Latin, because some of the manuscripts are Italian. And if he had a double Z, he would do what I would do as a calligrapher, is have the second Z nested with the first one. Then he also sometimes made his T's in the text as an uncial form and oversized. I'm trying to remember what else is distinctive. He would end, if an R was the last word of a letter, he would often make a capital form of R, a small cap R, which I think other calligraphers did. I don't think that was unique to Sanvito. Those are the ones I can think of off the top of my head. And this is all described in her the corpus book, and also in an essay she did in, what was it, 1997 for an Italian catalog. So it's in Italian. I think she translated from her own English. And that essay, I think, is the basis for the text in the corpus. But that was where that was the first place that she outlined almost everything she knew at that point about Sanvito. And mentioned the arthritis, the H, the ligatures, the oversized letters. There's also, I'm not sure if this is unique to him, the CT ligatures sometimes have a huge gap. I've seen it elsewhere. So you think it's two words, but it's really like AUCTOR will be AUC, big, a giant sort of leash, and then TOR. But it's one word, even though there's a hole between the C and the T. And I think that scribe's getting tired. I don't think that was unique to him, but I've seen it in his manuscripts.
Lee L has two questions. He mentions that, referring to the 3D letters, in the sign world, we call the letter that comes out as prismatic.
Yeah, that prismatic. Jonathan Alexander calls them prismatic. He uses faceted, three-dimensional. I guess I never use prismatic because I think of prisms and the colors of the rainbow. But it is that same effect where it's an optical illusion depending on how you shade the two sides of that center line of that spine. If you just leave it, as a skeletal drawing, it's hard to tell whether you're intending it to be raised up or, incised. But that is one of the interesting things about these manuscripts is how Sanvito and these illuminators, and it's not just these manuscripts, other manuscripts that are not associated with Sanvito, how they took a letter that was inside and they turned it for the most part into a three-dimensional object, sometimes even indicating that it was made out of metal. And so there's a possible theory that they may have seen some actual metal from Roman inscriptions that were not simply incised, but actually had metal set into them. Most of that had been vandalized by the Renaissance, but some pieces of metal have survived in museums even today. And that one I showed at the very beginning that was flat, that gold S, that may have been copying one of these in somebody's private collection back in the 1440s, 1450s in the Venice area.
And Lee also asks, did the other polychrome scribes that you saw also have blurry gold letters? He's referring to
I can't really answer that because most of what I've seen of other scribes with the polychrome letters have been digitized images in the last couple of months. I mean, I saw obviously Tofio back in the 90s and maybe someone else. That blurry halo effect is only on a couple of manuscripts, at least in going through the images I have of the Sanvito corpus. And I don't know what the cause of it is, because I think that one that is super blurry is one that I never saw in person. The one that looks kind of like it's like everything is glowing radioactively. Other ones, you know, I mean, you have to realize that if it's gold on a manuscript, it's either shell gold, or if it's raised gold, then it's got to be on gesso. And I think the ones where the letters are fatter is because gesso is thicker than the colored, what Tilly calls colored inks, I would call colored paint, thinned out paint that they were using, or he was using. I think shell gold must have been used on some because they're not as golden. They're that sort of flatter color that shell gold does. I don't work with gold. Barry Morentz probably would know more about this than me, or some other people here. But that's one way that I've often been able to tell in an image when I'm looking at gold or yellow green is by the thickness of the letters. But the other thing is, I was fascinated by how Sanvito did his colored letters. Did he have 5 quills and 5 colored little dishes ready? Or did he have one quill that he kept wiping off and changing from the colored dishes? And given the way the spacing is on some manuscripts, sometimes I think he was just eyeballing things. You know, he was using one color and guessing as to where the color in between was going to go. And other times, I think he might have been cleaning his quill and just dipping from one color into the next color, because he's got a very good rhythm to the spacing. So if anybody wants to look at some of these things online, you'll check out the spacing of these capitals. It's not just the color. As I say, you know, as I say, I started out being incredibly skeptical of Sanvito being terrific, and the more I look at him, the more questions I have about what he did. And even when I don't like what he did, I'm fascinated by what he did.
Katie mentions that Katie, it could be from burnishing the shell gold.
Oh, you mean the halo?
The halo.
Yeah. I mean, some things may have, I mean, some of the things we've seen may be due to abrasion from the other page when the book is closed, and, you know, people opening and stuff. I don't, because I mean, these are not, you know, flat images. I mean, they're part of a book that's been used up until they, you know, ended up in people's, you know, private collections in the 18th, 19th century, and, you know, and then in libraries in the 20th century, you know, public libraries for many of them. I mean, some pages today, the frontispieces will have pieces of tissue protecting them, but that's the only, usually it's only those pages that have a full page of stuff that libraries put pieces of tissue. And not every library was doing it when I last saw these.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, thank everybody for coming. I mean, I'm gonna be doing a talk based on this for the SSI next June. I don't know whether it's strictly in person or they'll be doing a Zoom to go with it or not. I think Sylvie, who's here, might have an idea, but if not, but sometime between now and next June, they will let you know. And if anybody else wants me to give a talk on different aspects of Sanvito for their calligraphy group or society, let me know. You We can even do one where we can look at things and ask questions.
Barry Morris asks, did Sanvito leave any documentation about his process?
Not that I know of. Is Scott Dickerson here today? I never met Scott. I talked to him a couple times in email years ago. And what Scott wrote about Sanvito, the documents that he discovered about Sanvito, the focus was on his family, on workshops, on contracts and correspondence, wills, that sort of thing. So that's how he managed to get a more accurate sense of Sanvito's life and who he knew and why it's very plausible that his influence on Aldous, even though there's no direct documentation of the two of them meeting. And I don't know whether Scott, accepts some of my theories about Brainio and Sanvito, which I wrote up in 2008 for an Italian book about Brainio. But I don't remember Scott writing anything about workshop notes, and I doubt there's anything that survives. But if he'd be the one who would know, because he's been really good at plumbing the archives in Italy.
Okay, well, thank you very much to you, Paul, and to everyone who attended. I'll be sending out a link to the recording to all of the registrants of the Eventbrite event within the next 24 hours. For the first month, we're asking that people not forward it to anyone else. After that point, it will be made public. So.
Will it be available to other FOC members who are not here today, Raul?
My understanding is that we're supposed to keep it to the attendees of the lecture for the first month.
Well, then can you make it available to you and Clayton, who is in an airplane at this moment and could not be here?
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean,
and we do send it to everybody who registered, Paul, because some people are, it's the middle of the night for some people. So
I don't think you and registered, because he sent me an email saying he was going to be on an airplane and asked if it was going to be recorded. So I said I would see that there'd be a way for him to see it.
we will. I'll stop the recording now in case.
Sure, go ahead.